In today's video, we're going to be looking at Dan Hooker. The man has done it again, defied the odds. He's ranked 11, Gamrot was ranked number 5. He upset the odds and he's continued a 3-fight win streak in a very competitive lightweight division. And the question we're asking today, it would have been unthinkable a year ago, 18 months ago. Is Dan Hooker in a position where he's not only going to be competing for the lightweight title, but where he could possibly win it? I know there's going to be a lot of detractors thinking this is clickbait, he's got no chance, but in this video I want to take a look over the career of Dan Hooker, just pick out a few highlights, a few times where he was written off previously, and whether this could all come together in a picture-perfect storyline with Dan Hooker winning the lightweight title either late this year or early 2025. Now, if we're looking at times where maybe Dan Hooker was written off before, straight springing to my mind is the Arnold Allen fight. He went back down to 145. It was an ill-judged decision, wasn't it, really? I think it came just after the Poirier loss. He thought maybe the title run at lightweight's done for. He'll go back down to a lighter weight class. But Arnold Allen, he had this crowd, the London crowd behind him. That atmosphere that night was amazing in London. And I remember everything was just going in the UK fighters' direction. Arnold Allen destroyed Dan Hooker on the feet. I don't think Hooker got dropped. Again, a testament to the chin on the man. But Arnold Allen just took him to pieces. The elbows were cutting him, really bruising him. He did actually drop Arnold Allen during one of their exchanges. But Dan Hooker was just a beaten man that night. It was that night, more than any other, where I thought, realistically, this man's done. The journeyman status is confirmed. Always going to be an exciting fight, and I think that's why he's a particular favourite of mine. But realistically, any shot of him having a title fight has gone by the wayside, is out the window by now. However, I shouldn't be surprised that we're having a very different conversation this time round, after he's just beaten Mateusz Gamrot in what was a very competitive 3 rounds, but based on the new scoring criteria, Dan Hooker did more damage and he deserved the nod, which he got in the end. But it's been a pattern of Dan Hooker's career, and we've seen 3 phases in his UFC life. His first run in the UFC saw him beating Gilbert Burns. That's such a strange concept for us in 2024, with Gilbert Burns being this veteran welterweight. Went the distance with Hamzat, some people gave him that decision. And there's this guy, this Kiwi, who's been down to featherweight, actually knocked him out. It's a crazy sport, the UFC. And this falls under one of those weird matchups which you don't actually believe happen until you look back and watch the video. But yeah, Dan Hooker stopped Gilbert Burns. And he was on a tear, you know, he was really exciting. He's always been in exciting fights. And this is a thing we're going to come back to in this video. It's whether you sort of rate him as a fighter or not, you're always going to watch his fights. And then he got stopped by Edson Barboza, I believe. That was the one where Edson Barboza, he just couldn't miss with his shots to the body that night. I think people thought that maybe Dan Hooker's particularly vulnerable to the body. But if you look back at that fight as I did, the shots that he was landing consistently were incredible. And it was at that point where you thought for the first time, maybe Dan Hooker isn't title material. Again, he's sort of a true contender in that sense, but he'll never really step up. I think it was after this Edson Barboza fight where Dan Hooker went back to New Zealand, took stock and kick-started another run in the lightweight division. And it culminated in a big fight, a fight of the year contender. It may have actually won fight of the year, I can't remember, against Dustin Poirier. Now, Dustin Poirier, as we know, is similar to Dan Hooker, is never in a bad fight. I think looking back over the career of Dustin Poirier, if you can pick out one boring fight, then I'd like to hear it, because I can't think off the top of my head of a boring fight that he's been in. But I'm just looking now, that Dustin Poirier fight, yeah, so he beat Paul Felder via split decision in February 2020, and then 27th of June 2020 he fought Dustin Poirier. And that was an epic war. I saw Luke Thomas recently talking about this fight, saying that Dustin Poirier was destroying him and that the corner should have pulled in the towel, should have thrown in the towel. I don't remember it that way. I remember it as a back and forth war. There were times where both guys were hurt, and it was one of those fights where you just do leave something in the octagon. I'm not saying that neither fighter was the same since then, but it's definitely the kind of fight that can leave long-term effects. And Dan Hooker's been in that many at this point that he just seems to accept he's going to take damage in fights, but hopefully he comes out victorious on the other side. Following the loss to Dustin Poirier, he faced Michael Chandler in what was Chandler's debut in the UFC. Chandler was there to make a statement, and he did just that. A huge left hook that took out Dan Hooker. And you know what? For someone who's had such a great chin, this was such an uncharacteristic loss. I think it's more a testament to how hard Chandler hits. It was just Chandler's night. He cut a promo on the mic afterwards like he always does, and it just wasn't to be for Dan Hooker. Following that fight, he won a couple, lost a couple. He lost to Islam Makhachev, and we are going to come back to that shortly because that's very relevant now that Islam Makhachev is the current lightweight world champion. And he also lost to Arnold Allen. This is the failed featherweight experiment we were talking about. He thought he lost to Islam, who was he wasn't the champion at this time. He lost to Islam Makhachev in Abu Dhabi, and then decided, right, I'm going to go for a featherweight title run. That massively backfired. And at this point, everyone's thinking Dan Hooker's done. It'd be a brave person to put their hand up at that time, just after he's lost in London to Arnold Allen, and say 2024, impressive 3-fight win streak, and Dan Hooker will be back in the title picture. However, he put together 3 pretty impressive wins. Claudio Puelles, Jalen Turner. The Jalen Turner fight was a real... I think that was one of those fights where the UFC were using it as a springboard for Jalen Turner. I mean, Turner's this guy. He's huge for the weight. He can hit hard. He's the kind of guy that you can put in good events because he'll be in exciting fights and knockout artist. But Dan Hooker upset the odds. He grinded out a split decision, I believe it was, a split decision against Jalen Turner. And then he did pretty much the same last weekend. It was a very different type of fight. Gamrot, we knew who was going to wrestle, but under the new scoring criteria, Hooker was threatening more, threatening the submissions from the bottom, doing more damage on the feet, and quite rightly, he got the nod. So, that takes us up to the present day, and where does that leave Dan Hooker in the title picture, or against the big fights that are out there? The rematch with Dustin Poirier, the big money fight against Conor McGregor, and then the title fight against Islam Makhachev. I want to look at all 3 of these matchups, see how we think Dan Hooker would do against each of them, and whether Dan Hooker as a lightweight champion is a realistic thing to be discussing in 2024. Now, Dan Hooker against Dustin Poirier is an interesting one. It's the one that we've got the most film on. He has fought Islam Makhachev before, but that was over pretty quick. So, Dan Hooker against Dustin Poirier. Dustin Poirier's been in more wars since then, they both have. They're both older versions of the fighters who fought each other 4 years ago. However, I think the time's right for this kind of fight. Both fighters want to go out on their shield, and I think it probably would be a retirement fight if either fighter lost at this stage. The other fighter is putting themselves in a prime position for one last title fight. I don't know, I've lost count how many that would be for Poirier now, but I think Dan Hooker needs a big name on his resume, like Dustin Poirier or Charles Oliveira possibly. And I think Dustin Poirier is a winnable fight for Dan Hooker. Look, we saw Dustin Poirier's chin get cracked by Justin Gaethje, incredible head kick. But I think Dan Hooker, in his confidence, in the state he's in right now, he could take apart Dustin Poirier. And I'd really like to see that fight. Look, you don't want Dustin Poirier building that downhill pressure, because when he gets fighters hurt, like we saw against Benoit Saint-Denis, Dustin Poirier is a problem for anyone. But I truly feel like Dan Hooker could beat this version of Dustin Poirier. It would be a good matchup either way. It'd be a close fight, like all of Dan Hooker's fights will be at this end of the division. The Conor McGregor fight's really tricky. Obviously, it's the fight that he's pushing for. I literally just saw something before I started pressing record where Dan Hooker was calling out Conor McGregor, saying, I'm the better fighter than Michael Chandler. That makes complete sense. You're going to sell yourself for that fight because it's the money fight. It's kind of the legacy fight in a way, other than actually winning the belt. So Dan Hooker against Conor McGregor, how does that fight look? We just don't know. What's Conor look like coming back? He's not coming back to lightweight by the looks of things. He looks huge. So Dan Hooker would need to go up to welterweight. Dan Hooker's the longer guy, the more active guy. It could be a long night for Conor McGregor. At the same time, I don't want to make too many predictions on this because we don't know whether Conor McGregor's coming back or not. But if Dan Hooker gets this Conor McGregor fight, all the best to him. Now the big one, or the maybe slightly bigger one, depending on your perspective. Dan Hooker against Islam Makhachev. In the first fight, it was one-way traffic. Islam took him down, and it was a Kimura finish. And Islam can do that against anyone, realistically. Islam's the #1 pound-for-pound fighter on the planet right now for a reason. But could Dan Hooker beat him? Can I make a case for Dan Hooker beating him? Let's compare Gamrot and Makhachev's games. They're both wrestling heavy. You definitely give the striking edge to Islam Makhachev, who's shown huge improvements over recent fights in the striking department. However, can you see Dan Hooker threatening the same from the bottom? Going for those guillotine shots? Possibly not. This is a really hard one to sell. I'm trying my best to do it now, to visualise it, see how I truly believe this fight will go down. And I think there would be a lot of control from Islam Makhachev. But Dan Hooker's takedown defence, in general, he looked great against Gamrot. If he could grind out a similar performance, it would need to be over 5 rounds as well. Look, I'm asking a lot here, but it's not impossible. I know you've only got the first fight to go off, and if you're just going off that, it doesn't look good for Dan Hooker. But let's just believe for a second that he can threaten Islam once the takedowns come in. He can go for these guillotines. He can do his elbows and knees through the middle. Dan Hooker could possibly get this decision. I don't think he could stop Islam Makhachev. I'd be hugely surprised. The odds for this fight would be huge in favour of Islam Makhachev, with good reason. But we live in a world currently where Dan Hooker's top 5. He could, with one more big win, get a title shot. What do you think? Do you think Dan Hooker has any chance of beating Islam Makhachev? I'd be really interested to see what the consensus is here. I'd imagine it's sort of a 95-90% to Islam Makhachev. I know there's a lot of hardcore Dan Hooker fans out there, me being one of them. But realistically, Islam Makhachev would be the huge favourite. Even more so than Gamrot was in their fight. It might just be one of those cases where Dan Hooker, unfortunately, is just in the Islam Makhachev era, where you could put other champions, maybe apart from Khabib, over the last sort of 15 years, put Dan Hooker in there, randomly drop him in, and he might have a chance to get a title. Maybe it's just not his era. The other thing is a pattern that we've seen in Dan Hooker's career that I briefly touched upon. He puts these streaks together where you think, this guy's a true contender, and then he'll just fall short. As we said, it was the Edson Barboza. That was the first peak that he got to, and then he fell short, and then he built up some more momentum, and he ultimately lost that decision, that exciting decision, to Dustin Poirier. After the Dustin Poirier fight, the sort of the comeback wasn't as consistent. He became a bit of a 50-50 fighter, and the loss to Arnold Allen was really the moment where he thought that he's done. But he's got 3 impressive wins at lightweight back-to-back. The only worry is for his fans that put him against a true contender now, someone in the top 3, that it'll be the same old story. But this version of Dan Hooker looks more confident, more relaxed, more comfortable in his own skin, in his own tattooed skin than ever before. Do you think we could see Dan Hooker wearing that UFC belt? I'm not sure I can really picture it, but stranger things have happened. You have to take solace in the Charles Oliveira story. He was someone who's written off multiple times, maybe even more so than Dan Hooker, but people have short memories with this kind of thing. After the title defences, after beating Dustin Poirier, Justin Gaethje, people forget he was written off. Could Dan Hooker do it again? I'm really intrigued to hear what you have to say about this. I'm sure that most of you agree. He's one of the most exciting fighters in the UFC. We're going to miss him when he hangs up his gloves. But yeah, let me know what you think, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel, and thanks for watching.